Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 17, Raiders. The elemental took them through the trees, its movement near silent despite the way it moved the earth. It said nothing, and his companions chose not to speak, fleeing through the shadowed trees as though trying to outrun a pursuit that never came. Brianda kept a watchful eye on the forest and on her chosen master, but nothing came at them from either earth or sky. It was as though the theft of Sofriel's soul had taken the fight from him. We could be so lucky, she thought, feeling fatigue tremoring bone deep. She glanced at the sky, noticing the black fade to grey just as they reached the edge of a narrow road. There, the elemental slowed, and she took a moment to flex her hands around the earthen ridge she gripped for balance. Taking a moment to study the path, she realized it was more than a logging track. Probably the road to the border, she thought, trying to recall what her previous master had said about the roads in Deverath. Criacole, she recalled, was one such waypoint. She tried to sit up straighter to get a better look, but the trees had grown closer together the further they travelled from Wilderjohn and where the rivers met. The constant twisting and turning her mount had made as it wove its way between them had made her body ache. Looking across the road and seeing how close and tall the trees grew, Brianda dreaded the journey through them. It was a relief when the largest of the elementals, the one that carried Grunwald and Raomar, cleared its throat with a wet, gritty rumble. "We leave you here," it told them. "Criacole lies beside the river, and once its men return with the morning's catch, they will come to the forest to seek its bounty, and we risk too much if they see us." "I understand," Raomar said, sliding from its back but retaining his hold on it in order to keep his balance. Grunwald dropped down beside him, staggered, righted himself, and stood close enough to offer support should he need it when the elemental moved away. "What can you tell us about the town and its people?" he asked. The elemental cocked its head. "The men fish and hunt the forest, and the women take care of the catch just as they take care of anything else that happens during the day." "And will we be safe?" Syndra's question sounded fretful, but the elemental didn't seem to notice. It rolled its shoulders in a long shrug. "Even Deverath's king finds them close-mouthed, and his patrols have never found anything to rouse suspicion. You'll be safe here for a few days." They all stared at it, not quite able to believe that their journey had come to an end. When none of them responded, the elemental carrying Rurineth and Alessia gave a dramatic shiver and sidled impatiently. "It is time for you to leave us," it said, "and leave you must, for time grows increasingly short." "We're going," Raomar replied, signalling Brianda and Ghost should dismount, and nodding toward Rurineth and the apprentices. "Come on, they've carried us far enough." The elemental stilled, changing its body so it was easy for the mage to step clear, taking Alessia's still sleeping form with him. Brianda felt her own mount still and slid from its back, reaching up to help Ghost. The girl gave her a pitying look and slid clear on her own, deftly avoiding Brianda's hands, although she swayed a little as her feet hit the ground. "I can take care of myself," she declared, keeping her voice soft as though the forest might overhear her. Or something in it, Brianda thought, watching as the child wove her way to Raomar's side. "You must hurry," the largest elemental instructed. "The mistress of the fief will be away from her keep soon. You need to meet her before she joins the other women in their labours." "My thanks," Raomar said, stepping away from it and inclining his head toward the others. Brianda followed his gaze, feeling her ex-mount sidle away as she did. Resisting the urge to look back, she moved to help Sindra and Zareen from their mount. The two apprentices moved even more stiffly than she and Ghost. Too much time with their books, Tara thought, noticing that Alessia was now standing on her own 2 feet, albeit with Rurineth's support, and that, while Sindra moved to assist her mistress, Zareen only had eyes for the shapeshifter. She also noticed the glance that passed between Rurineth and the wizardess, and knew they would both have something more to say about the girl's fascination. As soon as she thought it, she noticed the tension flowing around Sindra, and that Raomar also seemed affected. Even Grunwald appeared to have noticed, and concern creased his brow when he glanced at the girl. For her part, Zareen seemed almost defiant. Instead of meeting Raomar's gaze when the priest studied her, she gazed past him into the forest at the side of the road, and he decided not to pursue it. Instead, He drew his cloak over his hair, pulling it close so its folds concealed his face and all evidence of his race. It was the first time since they'd left the temple that Brianda had seen him cover himself like that, and it reminded her of the legends surrounding his kind, and that they were heading into a place where those legends might be more real to its inhabitants than many others. Again she drew on what her deceased master had told her, piecing together legend and what little they knew from travellers' tales. Yes, they might have experienced Kavarag here, she thought, and shivered at what might happen to Raomar if he were found. Her gaze fell on Ghost. The girl, too, she thought, slipping her cloak from her shoulders and walking to where Ghost sheltered by her master's side. Here, she said, proffering the cloak. You will need it more than I do. Ghost scowled and seemed about to refuse when Raomar reached over and plucked the cloak from Brianda's hand. Thank you, he said, draping the garment around the young elf's shoulders, arranging it carefully over her hair and around her face. He favoured her with a brief nod before returning to Ruineth. Turning to Ruineth. You'd better take us to the keep, he ordered, and the mage looked him over, then nodded in approval. And you'd better walk with me, he replied. That way, if your cowl should slip. My thanks, Raomar acknowledged, drawing Ghost closer. We'll stay close. Ruineth waited until they were by his side, relinquishing Alessia to Syndra's care, but not trying to discourage Zareen from the place she had chosen. Ruineth waited until they were by his side, relinquishing Alessia to Syndra's care, but not trying to discourage Zareen from the place she had chosen with the mage. He probably knows it would be wasted effort, Brianda thought, observing the way the girl had entwined her hand in the mage's. To his credit, the shapeshifter didn't try to shake her loose. Brianda dropped back to cover the rear, receiving a nod of approval from Grunwald as the Northman took up post just behind his master. It made her feel a little better, although she missed Varan, knowing the boy would have walked with her. For a moment she felt lonely. Then she heard hoofbeats. Riders! She called, pitching her voice low so it would carry to her companions and not much further. Raomar grabbed Ghost's hand and swept an arm around Syndra's waist as Grunwald enveloped him with one arm and took them into the bushes at the edge of the road. Alessia was dragged with them by dint of Syndra's vice-like grip on her hand, but Zareen froze. Ruineth stopped beside her, turning as though to comfort her, but the sound of the hoofbeats grew louder, and Brianda knew they were out of time. She leapt toward them. Get off the road, she ordered, shoving them into the bushes and not bothering to try and follow. The hoofbeats sounded too close. The sound of them rose around her like thunder, and if she hadn't already been running, she'd have been rooted to the spot. With a curse, she ran harder, if only to draw the rider's attention and preserve her companion's hiding place. She caught the sound of bushes rustling and realized someone had been about to try and rescue her, just as she'd rescued Ruineth and Zareen. Not this time, she thought, and put on a spurt of speed, hoping whoever it was had the good sense not to endanger the rest of the group by revealing themselves. With any luck, I'll be too far out of reach and they'll know to leave it. A muffled curse followed her flight, and she recognized the frustration in Raomar's voice. It wasn't hard to imagine Grunwald pinning the beast elf in place, and her heart eased. At least they'd be safe, and they could always rescue her later. Her efforts were rewarded by the sound of a shout rising above the thrum of hooves, which was when she remembered the village ahead and guessed the riders hadn't come for her. Which can only mean one thing, she thought, and raised her voice in a shout of her own. Raiders! She cried. Riders! The voice that had shouted now bestowed a curse, and she couldn't help laughing. Raiders! She shouted as the first few cottages came into view. Riders! Ahead of her, doors opened and the inhabitants started to emerge. Riders! She screamed and had the satisfaction of seeing people duck back into their homes, slamming their doors behind them. Raiders! She took a sharp right, diving around the corner of the nearest building. The ground shook under her feet, a rider taking the corner behind her. She threw herself around another corner. Something hummed as it whirred through the air, but it passed behind her. Riders! She cried. Raiders! Guards! Guards! Behind her, the majority of the riders continued down the street, all save the one riding hard on her heels. Clearing the building, she saw fields and a child by a well. bucket in hand, and mouth agape with shock. "Hide!" she screamed, and had the satisfaction of seeing him bolt to the cover of a pile of logs stacked by a nearby shed, the bucket clattering to the ground in his wake. One less for the rider's trade. She bolted past the well, deliberately leaving the woodpile behind her and making for the forest bordering the field. This time the hoofbeats didn't slow. Without a building to foul its steps, the rider's mount pivoted as fast as she and rapidly closed the distance. The distinctive whirring sound came again, and she skipped to the side, only to feel something wrap itself around her ankles. She managed to throw her hands forward to break her fall, and the horse's hoofs sprayed dirt across her back as it skidded to a halt beside her. Brianda rolled, trying to put some distance between herself and the prancing mount. The sound of the rider landing beside her gave scant warning of what was to come. "Think you're smart," the rider snarled, and Brianda realized it was a she, not a he, as she'd thought. "Not that it makes any difference," she thought as the woman sank a boot into her side. "Well, you're not so smart now." Brianda saw the boot going back for another kick and pushed herself to her knees. "Just try it," she thought, not stupid enough to make the remark out loud. Her face must have said more than she intended, though, for the woman smiled and stepped into the kick. Brianda jerked her head back in time for the boot to miss her face, and with a grimace of determination reached up and wrapped her arms around the woman's leg, jerking her attacker off balance and tumbling her to the ground. "She-dog's bitch," the woman snarled, rolling to her feet, but Brianda wasted no time. She drew a dagger and slashed the leather thongs that had brought her down. The blade was sharp and the thongs parted with little effort, but by then the rider was on her feet and reaching for her sword. Brianda threw herself back, giving herself enough room to pull her own sword free of its scabbard. The rider's blade flickered toward her, but Brianda caught the first strike, deflecting it with the dagger in her offhand, even as she attacked with her shorter blade. "You had your chance," the rider snarled. "Now it's gone." "To the hells with you!" Brianda snarled back, just as a new voice intervened. "Ha! Bold words for the one who's yet to secure her kill." The rider hesitated, glancing beyond Brianda, who chose that moment to slash forward, using the rider's distraction to her advantage. Unfortunately, the rider was more alert than she looked. Her lips curved in a tiny smile of satisfaction as she deflected Brianda's blade. "Who needs to secure a kill with skills as low as these?" she asked in silken tones, feinting beneath Brianda's thrust and striking out twice in retaliation. Brianda drew a sharp breath, managing to avoid the blade, but only just. For the second time in less than a moon cycle, she felt the cloth of her tunic tear. Pain and heat caused her vision to dance, and the field's edge seemed impossibly far, and the trees beyond them a distant dream. A whip cracked behind her, making her jerk in surprise. She started to glance toward it, only to force her attention back to the rider. Her lapse in attention cost her another ragged slash in her tunic, this one searing across her ribs as well. The next crack of the whip was accompanied by a burning sting across her sword hand. Against her will, her numbed fingers released their hold on the blade, and she half turned to see the source of this new threat. "I thought I was the rider's kill," she thought numbly. A third whip crack heralded the lash coiling around her throat. It swiftly tightened, making her gasp for air as the world before her blurred into a shimmer of color, and all other sound was drowned by the sudden roaring in her ears. The rider gave a disappointed growl, and the woman sheathed her blade before turning back to her horse. "Fine, you can have her then," she grumbled, as Brianda raised her dagger toward the lash. The action brought immediate reprisal. A swift but powerful jerk pulled her off her feet, and she landed hard on her back. The impact drove the dagger from her hand and the wind from her lungs, and she lay there, stunned, as the lash tightened around her throat. She lay there blinking and trying to breathe before raising both hands to the leather coiled around her throat and trying to loosen it enough to draw breath. That was the only movement she made, and it went unpunished as she listened to the sound of her captor's quiet approach. He crouched beside her, his gloved hands pulling the lash noose tight. "Let go," he commanded, leaning in so that she looked up into a pair of eyes so cold and grey that she obeyed. "Very good," he said, and held out one gloved hand, palm up. "Hands to me." Terror formed an icy ball in Brianda's gut, but she saw the fingers of his other hand tightening their grip on the whip and felt the noose tighten, and knew better than to disobey. Bringing her hands to the front, she held them up, trying not to care that he would bind them, or that all chance of escape was, for the moment, gone. Sradek, her captor ordered, and another figure, solid and dark haired, stepped into view. Come see the hero, and bind her hands good and tight. The other man obeyed, and only when he was done did the first loosen the lash from her throat. Again he regarded her with those strange grey eyes, and this time Brianda shuddered. The rider smiled. Get up. Brianda obeyed, rolling carefully to her knees before staggering to her feet. Follow me. Again Brianda obeyed, walking past the dark-haired man to where two horses waited by the well. She watched as her captor mounted and didn't resist when he leant down and scooped her up, settling her before him. His partner passed him the reins, and he accepted them, pausing to lift her chin and tilting her head back to meet her eyes. Don't try to escape, he murmured. Sit still before me. Brianda heard the thready accent of magic in his voice, and fought to resist it, feeling the suggestion in his voice flow over her mind. It sought, but couldn't find, a hold, and she knew she stayed where she'd been placed by her own choice, and not through any domination of her will. The realization made her smile. Yes, she whispered, answering the sudden uncertainty in his eyes with a wider smile than before. His gaze hardened in answer, and his face became a mask of anger and impending death. Brianda found her gaze caught and shrank against the pommel of the saddle. Do not, he gritted in warning, defy me. You've already cost me more than I cared to pay. He snagged one arm around her, pulling her tightly against his chest, just as a cry came from the center of town. The ships return! There is movement at the keep! Ride! The grey-eyed man ordered, spurring his horse toward where the green-lit forest swallowed the road. Brianda gripped the saddle pommel, willing herself not to fall, willing her tired, benumbed fingers to keep their hold, even though it took all her will to get them to obey. Whatever came next, she knew Raomar and Grunwell wouldn't be far behind. I only need to survive until then, she thought, and only hoped she could.